Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Privacy Day event here at Carnegie Mellon. I am Norman Sedeh, Professor of Computer Science, and together with Laurie Krainer, we are co-organizing this event in partnership with the Master's Program in Privacy Engineering, which, as many of you probably know, is a first-of-its-kind program to train people to effectively be able to work with industry and government and help inform the design of new products, services, business processes, taking into account privacy considerations as well as technical and business considerations. Privacy Day, as you probably also know, is an international event celebrated in not just the US, but also Canada, the European Union, and a number of other countries. And it's really about raising awareness about privacy, ongoing privacy practices, encouraging debate in this area. And as part of this event here at Carnegie Mellon, we've got a number of different activities that have taken place today. So earlier, students in the master's program in privacy engineering were actually holding clinics at the UC, where they invited people to come and spend a few minutes with them if they wanted to learn more about privacy risks and how to best protect yourself across a number of different scenarios, from mobile and social networking to browsing to phishing attacks and so on. And this was actually very nicely attended, and they did a really great job at organizing that. This next activity today will involve a keynote, and we're going to have our dean from the School of Computer Science, Randy Bryant, come forward in a minute to introduce our keynote speaker. Another activity that takes place right after this is a research fair where, again, students, master's students, PhD students, postdocs will be presenting some of the many activities that we have going on here at Carnegie Mellon in the area of privacy. I think we've got 20 plus posters. We could have had many more if we wanted to, but we tried to limit the number of people who would showcase their research, take into account limitations in terms of space and time as well. And in particular, as I'm giving this brief introduction here before the session starts, I'd like to acknowledge some of the people who've played a key role in helping organize the event today. So in particular, please raise your hand. Adam Durity, who is a student in the master's program in privacy engineering. He's spent a huge amount of work. We're not going to ask him how much. It's embarrassing. Putting this together, many moving pieces in putting an event like this today. So thank you very much, Adam. Ashwini Rao, if she's here, a PhD student of ours who's also been involved in a study that was conducted on Monday. I'll tell you a bit about that in a minute. And obviously a number of other people. Tiffany Todd has taken care of the logistics. Tim McNulty, working with our provost, has helped invite our keynote speaker and arrange for a number of other things. And I'd like to also acknowledge, obviously, my partner in crime here, Laurie Krainer, for her help organizing this event. So I mentioned this study that was conducted by our students earlier this week. So this is one of those studies that are always eye-openers in terms of how little people know about ongoing data collection practices and how they feel about these things. And you might have seen similar studies conducted before, but our students decided they were going to conduct their own in this space. And I'm not going to tell you all the different findings that came out of that study, but I thought I would illustrate a couple of the things that have come out of this study, and you might have seen similar things before, and they might potentially provide food for thought and discussion later during the day, whether as part of the keynote speaker presentation that we have, or the conversation that Laurie will have with our keynote speaker later, or perhaps as part of conversations you might want to have with our students during the poster sessions later today. So here are a couple of interesting stats. So what they did is they brought in 160 people from campus, so presumably, you would hope, people who know a bit more about privacy and data collection practices than the average person in the street, and they asked them a number of questions, true or false types of questions. Do you believe that this is taking place? Yes or no? And so an example of a question that they asked had to do with, for instance, is information about your religious beliefs readily available for sale, right? And as you might guess from this question, the correct answer is yes. But surprisingly enough, roughly half the people, and I don't remember the exact statistics here, but approximately half the people didn't realize that this was the case. Another question was testing their knowledge of the law. And so if I remember correctly, this question had to do with whether or not advertisers can readily access information about prescription drugs that you might be taking. And those of you who know a little bit about this space understand that this information is readily available to advertisers. But people who took this survey were extremely surprised. Most of them didn't know that this is actually something that you can purchase for effectively a few dollars. So those are the kinds of things that our students found. So clearly, this is why we have Privacy Day, right? It's to increase awareness in this area. And they also wanted to find out how concerned people were. And there are many ways of eliciting these sorts of responses from users. So what they did is they figured, well, perhaps we could show people, participants in this study, actual profiles being collected by these large data aggregators that are out there. And so after people had answered all these true-false questions, they actually showed them profiles. And they said, how do you feel about this? And clearly, many people were surprised. I think the stats were 10% of people claimed they were not too concerned, but 62% were extremely concerned. And so those are the kinds of things that effectively motivate the organization of an event like this. So this is about all I want to say. I think I've already spoken more than I should. So at this stage, I'd like to invite our dean, Randy Bryant, to come forward and introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Nicole Wong. Nicole is currently serving as the Deputy U.S. Chief Technology Officer in the White House, advising on internet policy and privacy. But she comes with a great background for work in this area. Namely, her training, formal training, is in journalism and law, receiving degrees at Berkeley, but then working at Perkins Cole, which is a well-known IP law firm in the Bay Area, and then at Google, doing a lot of advice with Google on their policy and practices regarding privacy and security, and then for a short while at Twitter until she got recruited to come to the White House. So I'm really looking forward to what you have to say, Nicole. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Thank you, Dean Bryant and Professors Craner and Sada, who've given me such a warm reception on a very chilly day. I am from California. This is not normal for us. But congratulations to all of you on a very successful data privacy event. I can't even say it's a day. You apparently have gone on for an entire week on this. Over the years, I've had a couple opportunities to teach internet law and policy at Stanford and at UC Berkeley. So it's actually really comforting for me to come back to an academic community, even if it's only for a day. As Dean Bryant was saying, in my previous jobs, I worked for Google for almost 8 years and also for Twitter. And my primary responsibility at those companies was to help them launch their products and do it worldwide and do it in compliance with all of the applicable laws, which included copyright and trademark and consumer protection and content regulation. And the issue that seemed to grow in complexity every year was privacy. So in my new role as Deputy CTO, I focus primarily on internet and innovation policy. And as you can imagine, privacy is also a critical component of this work. We as a country have been fortunate to witness exponential growth of digital technologies and technology that empowers citizens around the globe, fuels economic growth, and provides the foundation for further innovations. But given the quickly changing nature of our technological capabilities, I think we all recognize that we need to continue and accelerate our work to address how various entities, public and private, gather and use information. You are all well aware that the volume, variety, and velocity of data is greater than ever. We need cutting-edge research institutions like Carnegie Mellon to help us distill the value from the growing availability of data while protecting privacy and security in the use of personal information. So today, back among my privacy geek peeps, I wanted to come and talk to you in kind of a wonky way about privacy and design and the importance of a collaborative approach to both technology and policy. And then I want to tell you about an exciting new study about big data analytics that President Obama has asked us to undertake. And finally, I want to challenge you to bring us your best ideas. We are in an important moment, an inflection point in the scope and scale of data and its potential uses, and in which the social norms about privacy are in flux. As some of the literature shows, and apparently as some of your surveys have said, there is general agreement that privacy is a value, but not agreement on its parameters or its weight. For some people, privacy concerns arise from identity theft, and for others, it's about intrusive advertising or government surveillance or human dignity. As the privacy pioneer Alan Weston said many years ago, and I'm going to paraphrase, privacy is fundamentally defined by our context and our culture. So developing the norms about the proper use or protection of data takes time and the efforts of a constellation of players, technologists, industry, government, and civil society. So it's actually exciting for me to be here at Carnegie Mellon, where the legacies of Alan Newell and Herbert Simon and their interdisciplinary approach to technology issues is palpably thriving. And to meet with all of those outstanding students here today, working on the hard issues of data and privacy. Such a multi-stakeholder approach, drawing on the science and the talent of many disciplines, is critical to how we develop both innovative and enduring technologies and sound policy. In addition to involving many voices, we should also make sure that we continue to hear the most important one as we go about our designs and our discussions. The user, the citizen, the individual should continue to have a central place. In one of his final interviews, Herbert Simon was asked whether he thought technology might one day make humans expendable. And he reflected that it's not so much about the technologies as it is about, quote, ourselves, who are in the center of all this, and the need to be in the center of our own thinking. As we enter a brave new world of data, let us focus on the people who will use our technologies and build a digital ecosystem designed to ensure their benefit. So how should we think about these squishy values like privacy and their relationship to technology? 2 years ago, I taught a graduate class at Berkeley's Information School with Professor Deirdre Mulligan. And we deliberately cross-listed the course between schools and got a mix of mostly computer science, information management students, but also law, journalism, and public policy students. And the title, which I don't remember well because it was in keeping with academic tradition, several words too long, went something like Internet Policy and Grand Challenges on Global Platforms. Part of our conversation in that class was how do we embed values like openness or transparency into technology. The internet, of course, was built for openness and continuity, and importantly, if you ask Vint Cerf, flexibility, because its creators didn't really know what it would do. Those are values embedded in the technology, and they have served to frame the development of not just the architecture, but also indirectly the innovations and the policies that have grown out of and applied to the internet today. As the innovators of the country's first privacy engineering program, you are also well aware that there's a very active conversation among legal practitioners and scholars and regulators and policymakers, and most importantly, technologists, about embedding privacy as a value in technology, what they call privacy by design. For the most part, in the past, these have been distinct circles, engineering, legal, policy, but over the last several years, we've seen increased efforts to collaborate among those groups. In 2012, the Obama administration announced its Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights, which does two important things. First, it articulates clear guidance for consumers and companies about what they should expect from those who handle personal information. And second, it provides a blueprint for sustained multi-stakeholder engagement on privacy issues, such as the Department of Commerce-led forum to develop industry code of conduct. That forum recently developed a voluntary code for using privacy icons on mobile applications, and I know there's been some research done here at Carnegie Mellon about that. And they've just announced their next process, which is going to focus on facial recognition. Now, for sure, multi-stakeholder forums are not easy. Take, for example, the W3C process over Do Not Track. And it's going to take us some time to figure out how to get them right. But the collaboration between these three communities, I think, is essential for sound public policy making, particularly with regard to these technologies. Okay, so bear with me for a few minutes, because I'm going to try and get at this challenge about embedding values in technologies by talking to you about seatbelts, but I promise I'm going to bring it back around to privacy in a minute. In my class at Berkeley, we had the students read an old sociology article by the sociologist Bruno Latour, which was called "Where Are the Missing Masses? The Sociology of a Few Mundane Artifacts." This is actually a seminal article in sociology and technology, and Latour beautifully draws out the notion that technology and human behavior are intertwined in a relationship between the producers, the machines, and the users. And Latour starts his article by describing his frustration with his seatbelt. He writes, "Early this morning, I was in a bad mood, and I decided to break a law and start my car without buckling my seatbelt." And then he goes on to describe how first his car flashes a red light at him, admonishing him to fasten your seatbelt, and then it starts to beep, and you can almost hear him start swearing at the car as these technological forcing mechanisms worsen his mood, getting him to do something he does not want to do, and requiring him to obey the law. And the seatbelt, with its reminders and its insistent mechanisms, make him feel that the technology has removed his moral choice about obeying the law and keeping himself and others safe on the road. This notion of a technology encouraging or coercing moral behavior in a way that can become very deeply ingrained came back to me a couple years ago when I went to a movie with my then 11-year-old daughter, and we sat down in those big stadium seats, and she reached to put on a seatbelt. And she said, "Mommy, it feels unnatural not to have a seatbelt." And there is a long history of technology and public policy and law and court cases and public education that move us from Latour's resistance to that coercive technology to my daughter's natural habit. And the history of how we got there is instructive to those who work in the field of privacy, because safeguarding our personal information is also a story of technology and industry development and resistance, and government intervention and legal battles, and the development of social norms. And now is the time for all of us to put our shoulder to that wheel. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the seatbelt. First came the technologist. In 1885, Edward Claghorn nabbed the first US patent technology for something like a seatbelt, although when he described it, it didn't have anything to do with automobiles. And then more than 70 years went by, until 1956, when Volvo, Ford, and Chrysler each included and actively marketed a seatbelt as an accessory in their new models. And then in 1958, Volvo designer Niels Bohlin patented the first three-point safety belt, the type of safety belt you see in most cars today. Front seatbelts did not become required for cars manufactured in Europe until 1965, and not in the US until the following year. That's 81 years after the Claghorn patent. I'm going to take a minute to describe the seatbelt because it's actually a pretty smart technology. It was designed to be as unobtrusive as possible and simple to operate so that it could easily be put on and occupants would wear it, but easily taken off in case of an emergency. As even Latour noted, the seatbelt is translating two contradictory programs to be both lenient and firm in response to the human and the context. So this is all well and good, but how do we get scofflaws like Latour to wear them? Because that's the questions engineers ask themselves and their legal counsel and their regulators. Because it's all well and good for you to make me design this beautiful privacy tool, but no one's going to use it. It is too hard to design a product that is simple and effortless and will actually protect your privacy. You cannot make users care about privacy in the midst of trying to get something done. So actually the story of the seatbelt is more than the story of a technology. It's about the story of social norm making. If I go back to the history a little bit, in the 1960s, there was a huge economic expansion and consumer empowerment, and car ownership was moving into boom days after World War II because the automobile industry and the technology for producing automobile parts had unprecedented growth. So faced with a growing number of vehicle owners and consequently road accidents, the public grew increasingly concerned over the rising number of traffic fatalities on the nation's roads. And such fatalities had increased by nearly 30% between 1960 and 1965, with over 50,000 traffic-related deaths in 1965 alone. And the experts were forecasting 100,000 annually by 1975, unless something was done to improve traffic safety. It became the leading cause of death for people under the age of 44 in the US. Okay, here comes the consumer advocate. In 1965, Ralph Nader published a report called Unsafe at Any Speed, the Designed-In Dangers of the American Automobile. And he criticized the automobile industry for neglecting safety in favor of power and styling when they were designing their new vehicles. And he went on to testify before Congress. And in 1966, the government steps in. And Congress passed the Highway Safety Act and the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act, which, among other things, required the installation of seatbelts in cars. And then after nearly 20 years of regulatory wrangling and judicial proceedings, states were finally required to put seatbelt laws in place. As a result, in New York, where the first mandatory seatbelt law came into effect in 1985, seatbelt use rates increased from 16% before the law to 57% 4 months after the law. Fatalities decreased 19%, despite a modest increase in the mileage driven. And by September of 1989, 34 states had established mandatory seatbelt use laws. Today, every state has some form of a mandatory seatbelt use law, except New Hampshire, which, if you're trying to remember, I believe their state motto is live free or die. This is almost certainly more history than you wanted or expected or ever wanted to know about a seatbelt. So why? What can we learn? As an initial matter, let me say there are important distinctions between the story of the seatbelt and our current position with respect to privacy. First, as a society, we haven't quite agreed on what we want to protect. This is evident in the current and diverse set of research projects like the one you just ran here. And while the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights sets out certain values for our commercial sphere, our public policy debates are robust and evolving on a range of issues, from big data analytics to national security to geolocation data and the use of drones. We don't yet have agreement on a universal definition of privacy or in what context it needs to be protected. This makes rational engineering or policymaking very challenging. Second, we still lack important data. We don't have a FARS for privacy. In vehicle safety, they have the Fatality Analysis Reporting System, or FARS, which contains data about fatal traffic accidents within the 50 states and US territories. And that data is collected by trained state-employed analysts who gather, translate, transmit standardized and coded data about accidents on their respective highways. So working off the first problem, we don't have a universal agreement on what we're protecting, and we don't have a standardized way of describing it, or gathering data about it, or a measure to know if or when we've succeeded in solving the privacy problem. Third, we don't have a single platform for technology. A car is a largely uniform platform distinguished mostly by its features, but not its core function. On top of that platform, you can get manufacturer agreement on a universal seatbelt, a technology intuitively understood by any user, regardless of whether they switch cars, fixable by a non-specialized mechanic and deployed in any country. In contrast, one of the hardest things about privacy or data protection is that the data in question are collected on a huge number of platforms, online and offline, desktop and mobile, in an array of formats, forms, and interfaces. Right now, at least, no innovator wants to be locked into a universal privacy seatbelt. The good news is that we are now seeing growing competition to build one. Notwithstanding these hurdles in the privacy arena, there are some key useful insights from the seatbelt story. First, technology design is not the only tool in the toolbox. For vehicle safety, the ultimate goal is to create overall safety, which can be achieved through a range of changes to the ecosystem, including road improvements, better lighting, speeding laws, drunk driving laws, and public education campaigns. The same is true for privacy. So while it's incredibly important to do the types of foundational and applied research that you are doing here at Carnegie Mellon, at the same time, we should not rely on the discovery of a silver technology bullet. Instead, we should continue to work toward an overall strategy to improve privacy in the data ecosystem. Second, the change we're looking for must be driven from many sectors. We might avoid the decades of stalemate in vehicle safety improvements if public and private cooperation is cultivated. It has generally felt to me like industry and consumer advocates and regulators who focused on privacy were pretty good at this, mostly willing to engage in honest conversation about the challenges of privacy engineering and regulation. But we do tend to stalemate over differences in frameworks, priorities, and information, which is particularly amplified in conversations about global platforms or competing interests like security, criminal activity, and censorship. As we look at building a research and policy agenda, it is essential that we keep in mind the need for that interdisciplinary model and how to incentivize it. Finally, let me return to the real point of Latour's argument, which is that there is an exchange between humans and machines, where the machine is doing more than just assuming a delegated duty, like strapping you into a car or encrypting your data. The machine is making you feel secure, and you behave differently because of that. Here we're talking about more than just good mechanics. This is a situation in which the function of the machine can change the behavior of the human. And this is where the science of privacy reveals itself to be more than hardcore cryptography or multi-party computation or anonymization methods, although those all play important roles. We should be mindful that technology can be used to help shape individuals' expectations and behaviors. Technologies and interfaces that present themselves to a user as a vault create different behaviors than technologies that present themselves as a town square. Going back to my first observation that we still aren't quite sure how to define the privacy problem, I would suggest that we adopt a broad view and a big tent. The science of privacy is not only about how to keep personal data secure and private, but also how to enable individuals to live in the open with the flexibility of personas that we enjoy in the physical world. We should expand the frameworks to accommodate a range of values that include privacy, but also include health and economic equality and non-discrimination. We will need social scientists, privacy engineers, human-computer interaction experts, civil society. We might even need a couple of lawyers. This work will be challenging, but essential to the continued and healthy development of our digital world. And I very much hope that you will undertake your work here with an eye towards advancing it. Okay, so that was the wonky part. Let me tell you now how we're starting to think about privacy issues in government. In the more than 18 years that I have been working on privacy in technology, I do not recall a time when our government faced more scrutiny about its policies and practices in the use of data. We are at a difficult but formative moment as a nation and as global citizens as we work to apply our privacy values in light of the array of other challenges. It's in this context of a dynamic technology environment that the President directed a detailed review of the nation's surveillance capabilities. And over the last several months, we undertook a broad-ranging and unprecedented review of our signals intelligence programs, led by the White House with relevant departments and agencies across the government. In addition to our own intensive work, the review process drew on input from a number of key stakeholders that included Congress, the tech community, civil society, foreign partners, the Review Group on Intelligence and Communication Technologies, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, and others. The administration's review examined how, in light of new and changing technologies, we can use our intelligence capabilities in a way that optimally protects our national security while supporting our foreign policy, respecting privacy and civil liberties, maintaining the public trust, and reducing the risk of unauthorized disclosures. On January 17th, the President delivered a speech at the Department of Justice to announce the outcome of this review process. And in that address, the President spoke to the American people and the international community about how to keep us safe from terrorism in a changing world while upholding America's commitment to liberty and privacy that our values and our Constitution require. Our national security challenges are real, but that is surely not the only space where changes in technology and altering the landscape and challenging conceptions of privacy. That's why in his speech, the President asked John Podesta to lead a comprehensive review of the way that big data will affect the way we live and work, the relationship between government and citizens, and how public and private sectors can spur innovation and maximize opportunities and the free flow of information while minimizing risks to privacy. Councilor Podesta is going to be joined in this effort by the Secretary of Commerce, Penny Pritzker, by the Secretary of Energy, Ernie Moniz, the President's Science Advisor, John Holdren, and the President's Economic Advisor, Gene Sperling, as well as other senior government officials. Now, the President's interest in big data is not new. In 2012, the administration announced a $200 million initiative in big data research and development. By improving our ability to extract knowledge and insights from large and complex collections of digital data, those initiatives promise to help accelerate the pace of discovery in science and engineering, strengthen our national security, transform teaching and learning. In fact, I understand that Professors Christos Falutso and R.D. Singh in your machine learning department are part of this initiative. Last November, we were pleased to showcase dozens of public and private organizations who've created partnerships to enhance our national priorities. But with these incredible strides in harnessing data for public good, we must always be aware of the potential risks. So let me explain a little bit more about the Big Data Review and its scope and what you can expect to see over the next 90 days. Because we're undergoing a revolution in the way that information about our purchases, our conversations, our social networks, and our movements, and even our physical identities are collected, we want to think about this immense volume and diversity of data and the profound implications for privacy, the economy, and public policy. The working group on big data will consider all of those issues and specifically think about how the present and future state of technologies might motivate changes in our policies across a range of sectors. When we complete our work, we expect to deliver to the President a report that anticipates future technological trends and frames the key questions that the collection and availability and the use of large data sets raise, both for our government and for the nation as a whole. This is going to be a collaborative effort. The President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, known as PCAST, will also conduct a study in parallel to explore in depth the technological dimensions of the intersection between big data and privacy, and that's going to feed the broader effort. Our working group is going to be consulting with industry, civil liberties groups, technologists, privacy experts, international partners, as well as other national and local government officials about the significance and future for these technologies. We can take some of the lessons from the seatbelts here as well. We need to figure out what we're trying to protect, what benefits big data analytics can bring, and what values it can vindicate. We need to agree on how to measure our success and our risks. We need a framework for distilling the benefits of large data sets responsibly. While we don't expect to answer all those questions or produce a comprehensive new policy in 90 days, we do expect this work will serve as a foundation for a robust and forward-looking plan of action. The good news is that we have a community already focused on these issues and an array of tools to work with. So here's where I give you the challenge. As technologists, and particularly as technologists working toward embedding values like privacy in your work, you are uniquely positioned to advance this discussion. We need your best ideas, and we welcome them. So thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I'm looking forward to hearing more about the developments here at Carnegie Mellon. Can you share?
Yeah. All right. Well, so thank you very much. That was a really great talk, very inspirational. We have time for a few questions, but I'm going to be asking the questions. But I did talk to a number of my colleagues and students, and did get some ideas of things that they were interested in hearing about. So hopefully you'll hear some of the questions that you were interested in. All right, so to start with, our students are looking into what sort of careers they want to go into, and some of them are interested in industry, and some are interested in public service. And so since you have had experience both in the tech industry and now in government, what are some of the differences that you've seen between these two areas?
A, great question, and B, so excited this program exists. And it's a little hard for me to say, like, you should definitely go into this company or this sector or this part of government, because I took a very circuitous route to end up with what I do now. But let me pose it to you more as like what the function of privacy engineering can be and why it's so significant at this time in history. When I first started advising tech companies, which was 18 years ago, and my first internet pure play client was Yahoo. And they only had 2 lawyers in their legal department, and all they did was search, which seems like a really long time ago right now. There wasn't someone that I could turn to who was a privacy engineer. There wasn't someone who even specialized in privacy, because they still thought of themselves as software developers instead of a platform. What a privacy engineer can be is a bridge between folks like me who are trying to invest some values into what the technology can offer to society, and the actual technologists who will know how to make that real. When in my time at Google and at Twitter, I usually had to go and seek that person out because they didn't have a title that said privacy engineer. They did at Google much later, but that was only because I was begging them too much.
Good for you.
But I'd have to go and find someone who believed in this value and was willing to invest some of their 20% time at Google to build something that wasn't core to what they were otherwise trying to accomplish. The notion that this could actually be a real profession, a department of privacy engineering, is fantastic and something so needed. And the thing that I think is so important is I needed to find colleagues who were generous enough with their time and experienced enough in what they were doing to explain to me how their technology worked and what the implications were of what it could do. And then to talk to me in a real way about well, what if we wanted to do this for the user? What if we wanted to protect the user in this way? How would we do that? And to work through that whiteboard for hours until we kind of came up with something that we could work with. Wherever it is you end up, whether it's in government or private sector, look for the partners where you can be that bridge, because that is an enormously unique skill set.
All right, so there's been a lot of discussion about the NSA leaks, and I know this. We've talked about it a lot in my class. Last night, I watched the State of the Union, was listening for what the president might say about privacy. He didn't say very much, but he did discuss privacy quite a bit on January 17th in his speech. And so there's been a lot of discussion about the Section 215 bulk telephone metadata record collection. And the president mentioned a possibility that a third party might maintain that rather than the NSA going forward. And then following that, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board said that they thought that the bulk data collection was actually not legal to begin with. I had the opportunity to visit the NSA along with Dean Bryant about 2 weeks ago, and we heard a lot about their views on Section 215. And they're also their views about how the NSA was protecting this data. And so I'm wondering if you can shed some light both on the legality of the bulk data collection, but also about whether privacy would indeed be protected by having a third party maintain that data instead of the NSA.
We try to address it by sort of going to what the president articulated on the 17th. So this has been a several-month process. I think I arrived at the administration in July, and it was 2 weeks old at that time. In that several-month process, the president has gotten lots of input from PCLOB, from the review group, from civil liberties groups, and from the tech industry. And he crystallized it really in that speech he gave on the 17th, where he clearly recognized that the capability offered by the Section 215 program, which allows you to map the communication of a possible terrorist, and is an important one in his judgment, having taken all that input in. Because that was a gap that was actually identified after 9/11. You can imagine when a bomb goes off in an American city, you want to know, is it just that bomb, or is there a series of bombs that are about to go off? And he genuinely believes that this is an important tool for the intelligence program. That said, he was also very clear in that speech that he will terminate the program as it currently exists. He has already put into effect limitations on collection, that there must be a judicial finding before querying the database. And that is to give time to the second part of his plan, which is he has asked the Director of National Intelligence and the Attorney General to, in the next 60 days, present him with some alternatives to having the government host the bulk data, which gets to the question about the third party. The third part, having either the data stored at the providers or stored with a third party, actually came up in the review group recommendations, as they thought this might be an alternative. In the same speech, the president expressed, and it is genuinely kind of, he has some reservations about that as a solution and whether it will actually enhance a user's privacy to have it stored at a third party versus having it stored as it is today. And I don't want to get out ahead of both the Director of National Intelligence and the Attorney General. Like, they're going to go through a process, and I think it will be useful for us to see what type of alternatives they can come up with. And then we need to go to Congress, right, and figure out, with the termination of the program as it is, what is the next step, both legislatively as well as a practical matter.
Okay, thank you. Right, so you mentioned in your talk today about the Do Not Track effort and the multi-stakeholder process. And in general, these are the kinds of things that we've been seeing as far as privacy initiatives in the U.S., these more self-regulatory rather than a legislative or a regulatory approach to privacy. And I think some of these recent efforts haven't really produced much in the way of results. We don't yet have a Do Not Track standard, and the multi-stakeholder process, came up with some guidelines, and no one's really using them, and so we don't really have much. And so I'm wondering, at what point do you think it's time for actual privacy legislation, and what aspects of privacy might it make sense to legislate?
Yeah, no, I watched the both multi-stakeholder processes. So like the Department of Commerce leads a multi-stakeholder process where they're supposed to create voluntary codes of conduct, and the most recent one was the mobile application transparency, like privacy icons project, and facial recognition will come next, which I think, they were pleased to get to the conclusion of it. And I think it's a question of like, well, is there a conclusion? Like, what happens if we find out it doesn't work? Then do we give it up or do we iterate on it? And I think there needs to be a real conversation in government about how do you have a continuous improvement cycle, right? If we're going to start this multi-stakeholder process in the area of technology where A, technology moves fast, and B, we haven't built beta testing in, right? How do we do that in a way that both provides a sense of certainty, both for consumers and for companies, right? But also allows for figuring out, that so doesn't work, right? We need to try again. I sort of feel, so I think there's that aspect, and I don't know if that's a legislative fix or just a process fix. The W3C process with Do Not Track sort of had its other issues where I don't know exactly what will solve it. I do feel like when you have a multi-stakeholder forum generally, you have to make sure that everyone participating is actually invested in building a solution. Right? It can't be that we're all here just to debate and advocate our own position, but that we are prepared to actually add something to a conversation. And I was trying to describe this actually to like my kids. Totally geeky that I should be talking to my kids about multi-stakeholder forums, but like it's
your house sounds like mine.
Yeah, right. And so I went to a Legos illusion, which makes it even more geeky. Which like everyone brings their Lego block, and if we don't figure out a way and be incented to fit the Legos together, we build nothing. We all stick with our single block at the table, right? So somehow we have to figure out how do we incent people to build upon each other as opposed to just stick with their own block. Query whether legislation is the right thing that would incent that. That's possible. I referenced the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights that the administration put out in 2012. Those are principles we actually believe very strongly in and had at the time recommended for legislation. The Department of Commerce is actually working on draft legislation to offer into Congress. And there are two realities about that. One is working with Congress to get a privacy bill passed. And I think there's a second question actually about if we test the framework that we offered in the Privacy Bill of Rights against, for example, big data, do we still feel it fits in the right way? I actually think this 90-day study we're going to try and do about big data will hopefully flesh out a little bit of that, because some of the principles in the Consumer Privacy Bill of Rights are around transparency and context, and you can imagine some uses of large data sets where that's hard. So we don't want to legislate something where we actually already know it may not be possible.
Yeah, so you mentioned in the multi-stakeholder process there was no time for beta testing, and I would argue there was no time for really alpha testing or any testing. So there's some of us were involved in that, and Rebecca Valabecco, who's in the back of the room, one of my students, actually had the opportunity to participate in that process. And she kept going to the meetings and coming back and saying, well, they say they want to do user testing, but they're not organized, they don't have funding for it, there's nobody in charge of it. And finally, towards the end of the process, she came into my office and said, well, let's just do the testing. And so we did a little project here at Carnegie Mellon, and we did some testing and provided some input in the process, but it was very late in the process by the time we were able to do that, and so I don't think it had a huge impact on the end result. And our testing found that there was a lot of problems with the guidelines that they were about to release. And so I'm wondering, going forward, how is it that we can get this kind of user testing, which I think is sorely needed, and more of the consumer voice, because even it's multi-stakeholder, and the consumers are a stakeholder, but they're not at the table. How do we get that into these processes?
Yeah, and I'd love to talk to you more about the results of your test, but B, talk about the process. I think it might be that, right, we take what you found and we could send it back to government and their multi-stakeholder forum. We could ask government or industry to stand up its own continuation, knowing that the first thing we came out with wasn't quite as effective as we wanted, but we think we should iterate. The thing that I would say is, though, in figuring out critiques of the final product of the code, to me the more interesting question is, well, what will make it effective, right? What are the tweaks you would recommend? And this is sort of going back to let's build on the Legos. I don't want to walk away from it, because I think having gotten everyone to the table and a starting position is useful, and we shouldn't devalue that. But then the question is, so how do we build again and iterate on what they did and make it better?
Right. So you mentioned how valuable it was to you to work with technologists when you were working at Google and other companies. So what would you say are some of the main reasons why it's important to get technologists trained in privacy as privacy engineers, and what advice would you give to aspiring privacy engineers?
Well, so there's the part about being a bridge. I'll do a pitch for government, which is we need you. Really, really need you. And if you can feel like I'm missing my geek infusion, because I don't get a lot of geeks when I'm in government. I do think it's about being able maybe to communicate more broadly than your specialty right now. Being able to engage partners to help you get things accomplished. I do really believe multi-stakeholder models, difficult as they are, we will catch more things with more brains at the table that come from diverse viewpoints than if we try to solve it solely as a technology issue, solely as a policy issue, solely as a legal issue. So having more people who are prepared to be open to other viewpoints and collaborating in that way is useful. It was useful for me in private sector, but I can tell you it is a skill set sorely needed in government.
Great. Well, I think we're about out of time, and so we're going to wrap things up now. Before you leave, I want to remind everybody that we have a poster session starting at 3:30. That will be in the Newell Simon atrium on the third floor, and we'll have about 20 different privacy research projects being presented as posters. So I encourage you all to come and see these great projects, and let's thank our speaker.